everybody. Welcome to the Ames Public Library for How a Bill Becomes Law in Iowa, a program brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the League of Women Voters of Ames and Story County. I'm Kathy. I'm an adult services librarian here at APL. And the library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs like tonight's event. I also want to invite you to join us for future programs. For example, next Thursday at 7, we have The Truth About Political Polling, which features Professor Dave Peterson from ISU's Political Science Department. And that's next Thursday, the 24th of October at 7, also here at the library. And so at this point, I will turn it over to Linda from the League of Women Voters to introduce tonight's speaker.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm really excited about tonight's program because not only because of the content, but because I get to introduce somebody who I've interacted with at ISU and has been a friend of mine. And we've worked together with several students. Max Shelley, Dr. Max Shelley has been with ISU as a faculty member since 1979. He is currently a university professor of political science, statistics, and the School of Education, so that's 3 colleges that he works with. He teaches, conducts research, and interacts with the media on topics such as the political process, elections, research methods, and public policy. I could just squeeze one more thing about Dr. Shelley is that he's a great professor who works very hard to help students be successful. And whenever I had students that needed a little bit of assistance with statistics or research design, I called upon Dr. Shelley, and he never said no. And when I called him and asked him if he would do this presentation, I knew he wouldn't say no, and he didn't. So, Dr. Max Shelley.
Well, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Sound-wise? Great. Well, How a Bill Becomes a Law in Iowa, there's a story here, kind of plot and character development. I wanted to give a little bit of background, kind of the setting, if you will, for how all this happens. My guess is you've all probably been inside that building, right? Yeah, the Iowa Capitol. So that's where the stuff goes on, of course, legislatively. Governor's offices are in there as well. Judiciary shows up, and so it's more or less the center point of activity, political activity in particular. And it's a gorgeous building. What we're focused on for tonight basically is what goes on in the 2 legislative chambers, within each and then between them. And we actually have somebody who lives in the building.
Just wanted a refresher course.
Okay. Well, good. I've got lots of fact checkers tonight, so that's wonderful. So please feel free to jump in when I skip over something or don't see something quite right. So as you can probably guess, since the state senate is a smaller body, that's the one on the left. One on the right is the House chamber. And they're both nice places to sit in. I've been up in the galleries on occasion. I thought I'd just give a really quick background to the state legislature just for openers, and we'll talk about how the magic happens. So the Iowa General Assembly does come in these 2 flavors, Senate and the House. There are 50 members who serve 4-year terms in the Senate. There are 100 members on the House side, and they serve 2-year terms, so they're more or less always running for re-election, pretty much like for the U.S. House. The whole machinery dates back to 1839, kind of at the glimmerings of Iowa as a political entity. A good quiz question would be, where was the first place the legislature met? Not Des Moines, Burlington, as it turns out. And then moved to Iowa City. I'm guessing most of you have probably seen or been in the old Capitol in Iowa City, so that was the second home. First kind of more or less permanent location. And then since 1857, the legislature's been meeting routinely in Des Moines. Second Monday in January typically is when the sessions begin. And we just recently finished the 2023-2024 90th General Assembly. So this has been going on for quite a while. It's always fun, isn't it? As Herman can attest. Okay, the current political configuration, just to kind of get the numbers straight, there of the 50 senators, currently 34 are Republican, and of course 16 Democrats. Now that's really important because that gives the Republicans a supermajority, and it means, among other things, that they can more or less do what they want, I guess as a practical matter legislatively. But things like appointments, which even require a 2/3 vote, for them that's really not much of a problem, unless there's some defection along the way. That doesn't happen very often. The House is not quite as imbalanced currently, but pretty close. The House is 64 Republicans, 36 Democrats. And I don't know exactly what's going to happen, obviously, after the voting is done November 5th this year. But you can assume there'll be some movement. No way to tell what direction. The cast of characters, the ones who actually run the show, more or less, in these two bodies are the Senate leadership, President of the Senate, President Pro Tem, Majority Leader, Minority Leader, and Majority and Minority, of course, is generic. It's Democrats sometimes, Republicans other times. The House leadership side, there's a Speaker, Speaker Pro Tem, Majority and Minority Leaders. So that's kind of the leadership. And where do they come from? So you may know that we recently had a reapportionment, reallocation of geography to figure out where these people are being elected from. I'm going to flip back and forth between two slides here, just to try to make a point. It's sort of like in the upper northwest corner. And what you're seeing is that that's a Senate seat in green, upper left, and there are two House seats that are carved out of that. And that's pretty much the way it operates. The district that my wife and I are in right now, if you can see where the cursor is, well, let me see, let's do it this way. There's Story County, and we are here, basically. For the House seat, and then for the Senate seat, kind of similarly located. So you can tell where the population is concentrated. This tends to be relatively small amounts of geography. We happen to be in a component of Story County that recently was reapportioned out of Democratic hands into Republican hands. And so we kind of belong essentially with Boone County, Greene County, and Guthrie County, and a slice of Dallas, very rural and therefore very Republican, by the way. So this is something you're still trying to get used to. We used to have Democratic representation for decades, and now we don't. So I don't know if you had a similar situation, but that's kind of where we are. So there's a process about how an idea becomes a law. Notice it says idea rather than a bill. Bills have to come from somewhere, so we have to kind of start with the ideation part. The idea leads to a bill, which in turn leads to maybe a law. So how can you get a bill to be considered? Well, an individual senator or representative or groups of each can do it. The legislation could also start percolating through a House or Senate committee. And these bill ideas can also come from the executive branch. That's a thing that governors like to do, of course. The judicial branch also may be a source of legislative ideas. They talk to the legislature and do things like ask for money and different ways to run the judiciary. So when a bill is introduced by members of either chamber, it has to follow a fairly rigid process. And then if the bill is passed, it gets sent to the members in the other legislative chamber, and that process gets repeated. So bills have to be accepted by ordinarily just simple majorities in both chambers to move forward to maybe becoming a law, if the governor agrees. One really important catch is that the details matter, so the wording has to be absolutely identical between the House and Senate versions of the bill for it to eventually get to the governor for potentially final approval.
Just gonna cheat you over this way a little
Okay, sorry.
bit. Oh, no, no. Step up to it again.
How's that?
Is that okay, Kathy? Okay, thank you.
We're good. Thank you. Well, one of the major players, somewhat behind the scenes, but absolutely essential to understand how bills get drafted, how these ideas kind of percolate eventually into legislative language. They're senior staff members in the Legal Services Division of the Legislative Services Agency, or LSA for short, and they provide legal and legislative research services that you need to get a bill drafted. So the members will have an idea, they'll provide rough text usually for what would go in the bill, but the details, especially the legal side of what might go into legislation, that's essentially going to come out of LSA. And what the LSA staff will do, among other things, is check current Iowa code to make sure that what's proposed is acceptable under existing Iowa statutes. They'll also look at relevant publications. They can look at other state or even federal laws on the subject matter of that particular bill and figure out if it's going to have legs to move forward. And then after LSA works together with the proposers of the bill, the original drafter sends the bill to a legislative sponsor for approval, or sponsors plural, and then the bill gets prepared to be introduced on the floor, and then we hit the debate stage. Introduction of this on the floor before it can be debated is kind of a precondition. So after the bill's been drafted, essentially through LSA, it gets sent back to the sponsor for review, and if the sponsor says it looks good, then it gets filed with the Secretary of the Senate or the Chief Clerk of the House, and the bill gets assigned a number, House file or Senate file typically. And the bill then gets reviewed by the legal consuls who work for the House and Senate, and within maybe a day, typically, the bill has a number, a title, sponsor's name is attached, and it gets read, first reading in the Senate or the House. They're not quite at the debate stage just yet, but getting there. So the President of the Senate or the Speaker of the House then assigns the bill to a standing committee for review. And so that brings us to the standing committee. This is, in the upper right corner, maybe a representation of one of those committees at work. So a standing committee, they're actually sitting after all, but a standing committee is a group of legislators who are chosen by the leadership of each chamber, respectively, to act on a range of topics that they're empowered to address. And once a bill gets assigned to a committee, the chair of that committee appoints a subcommittee. It's often 3 people, 2 from the majority, 1 from the minorities, pretty common. And the subcommittee, carved out of the standing committee, then takes a look through the bill and figures out details that may have been missed earlier and reports its conclusions back to the full committee. And then the full committee talks about what the subcommittee has concluded. Often you'll get like 2-to-1 votes out of the subcommittee along strict party lines, almost always. And the full committee takes the subcommittee's report and vote into consideration and makes recommendations to the entire chamber based on what the subcommittee's work being processed through the full committee conveys. So the committee can recommend a bunch of different things. It could recommend that the bill be passed. It could recommend that there be amendments tacked onto the legislation. It could decide to refer the bill to another committee for further study. The bill could be postponed sort of indefinitely, and that's likely to happen if the majority leadership isn't sure it has the votes rounded up to pass the bill that they really want on the floor just yet. And the bill could be sent to the floor for debate without a recommendation. So there are several options here. House and Senate standing committees are pretty numerous. I know you can't read that well from where you're sitting. I thought I'd take you to the homepage for this. What we're looking at is the Iowa legislature's homepage, and that's kind of where all the important information resides. The standing committees are where the bulk of the action occurs for really important legislative decisions, but equally important, pretty much, there are a number of subcommittees who appropriate funds. You can pass all the bills you want if there's not funding to make anything happen. Nothing really gets implemented in particular. It pretty much always takes funding for that to occur. And there are some other major moving parts that are kind of shown here on the website. Okay, calendars. So a report of the committee's recommendation is sent to the Secretary of the Senate or the Chief Clerk of the House, and one or the other of those, depending upon whether it's a Senate file or a House file, will place the bill on the regular calendar, which is a list of the bills that are eligible to be debated. So we're not quite at the debating stage yet, but we're getting to that. So the majority leader in either chamber is the one responsible for deciding which bills on the calendar are going to be debated and when, what comes before another one. And if you really want to give legislative priority, of course, you give it a smaller numerical value, kind of indicating we want to get this soon. So then the bills are brought up for consideration by the chamber ahead of other bills that are listed before them on the calendar. So it's a situation in which the leadership kind of determines what sequence is going to be followed. It's kind of Halloween season, so I thought I'd talk about beware of the funnels in that Halloweenish kind of context. So I don't know if the word funnel conveys to you. Something you use to pour oil into an engine, maybe, right? Having done that a bunch of times, especially in really cold Iowa winters. So what are funnels legislatively? Well, these are like, roadblocks would be one way to think about them, or ways of sifting, funneling in the sense of sifting, basically, through the legislation. So there's a clock running in the legislative session, and typically Friday of the 8th week, which looks like it'll be March 7th, 2025, is when the first funnel is going to be hitting. That's based on what I was able to see online at any rate. And the second funnel, so the first funnel means that bills are going to be alive in this 8th week of the session if they got through a committee in one chamber, let's say the House, and that's the first funnel. Now, there are some exceptions. Anything involving money, kind of eventually, a state budget, that usually gets a free pass. And there's some others as well. I can show you a list in a moment. It gets kind of detailed. So anything that the leadership says is a priority may or may not be sifted away from floor debate in the first funnel. So the second funnel are bills that, but for the second funnel, Friday the 12th week, which is April 4th, by the way, for 2025, the bills have to be successfully through one chamber. They have to be voted positively from that chamber. And they have to get out of one committee in the opposite chamber by that date to continue to advance. So you can tell there are veto points here, right? Political scientists love to talk about veto points. And legislatures are just chock full of them. You notice there are a whole bunch of decision points that have to occur. And this is one of the major points at which legislation either gets changed so it might be acceptable to the majorities in both chambers, or it just simply dies on the vine. So those are really crucial considerations. Now we're at the debate stage, basically. So assuming things have got through the funnel and otherwise look good, so the chair of the subcommittee that kind of reported the bill back to the full committee usually becomes the bill's floor manager and argues on behalf of that legislation. Since this is almost by definition a partisan activity in most cases, You're going to have Republicans typically on one side of the issue, Democrats typically on the other. There may be some middle ground. Some bills pass with large majorities, if not unanimously, but that's pretty rare, especially these days. So the floor manager's job basically is to present the bill to the chamber and to follow its progress during debate. And members will discuss and they can propose amendments to the bill. Amendments would be adopted by a simple majority of the senators or representatives voting. So the debate basically allows discussion about the bill on the chamber floor and also breaks down key issues within the bill. It may eventuate that not the entire bill passes, some pieces may get winnowed out or amended to the point that maybe you don't even recognize it anymore and your idea just gets eviscerated in the process. That's certainly possible. So after the debate happens, the bill's title is then read aloud for the last time. And one thing that in this context makes the Iowa legislative process different from, say, the United States Congress. U.S. Congress, you can have, in the U.S. House, there are 435 members, right? So 218 is an absolute majority. You don't have to get 218 votes, though, in the U.S. House to get something out of that chamber. It could be a vote of 210 to 209, and that's still good enough, just so you have a majority of the votes cast. Not so in the Iowa legislature. So the constitutional majority requires that there be 26 senators voting for a bill for it to proceed through that chamber. And you have to have 51 representatives voting for the bill for it to get through that chamber. So that is one kind of interesting difference between the national and state levels for legislation. So you need a constitutional majority to send these bills upon their passage, basically, when it moves on to the other chamber. And if you don't get a constitutional majority, if you have a vote of, let's say, 24 to 23, and some people miss the vote, it's probably going to be dead at that point. Some things can get revived later on, if it's a real priority for the leadership, though. So gets through one chamber with the constitutional majority, and then amendments that were adopted by the chamber of origin, whichever it is, House or Senate, are built into the bill, and the bill then gets sent to the other chamber for action. And a bill introduced in the Senate is going to keep its original Senate number, SF something or another, as it travels through the House, and the HF House files will similarly kind of keep the same label, even though the other chamber is working on them. So if the bill gets further amended by the other chamber, things get even more fun, because then the amended bill goes back to the chamber of origin for a revisit. And the chamber of origin also can amend the amendment. So you can have a second order amendment, and things can get kind of interestingly complicated then. So you have lots of layers in some of the more complex and controversial kinds of legislation. So if the chamber that the bill originated in agrees with the amendments, the bill has passed both chambers. It has to get through an identical form, and LSA will be Johnny on the spot to kind of make sure that that's the case. And then at that stage, the bill gets sent to the governor for review. Okay, so of course the legislative process involves the executive branch as well as the pure legislative process. And bills don't become law unless they're signed into law by the governor or unless something else happens, and we'll talk about that. So what if there are major differences between the House and Senate versions? Often a conference committee is going to be formed. This would be a joint committee, kind of temporary. It's not a standing committee, but it would be a temporary joint committee of both Senate and House members that represent the majority and minority parties in both chambers. 10 members is kind of a reasonable size for a conference committee. It varies. Those are appointed by the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader on that side of the Capitol building, and the House equivalent, the Speaker and the Minority Leader will also kick in names. So basically what happens then is the conference committee members meet and they kind of thrash out these disagreements between the chambers and sometimes split the difference, sometimes not. If they can reach an agreement, not guaranteed and not required, but if they do reach an agreement, then that agreement gets reported back to both chambers for a committee compromise version. Now, that compromise version can't be amended. This is just going to result in a straight up or down second set of votes. However, if the report is rejected by either chamber, it's possible a second conference committee would be formed. And it will depend on how complex the legislative issue is, how controversial. One conference committee usually is what's going to happen, though. So if the conference committee can't figure out an agreement, the bill dies, unless it is one of these priority bills that the leadership really insists on getting through. And if the conference committee report is adopted, the chambers vote one more time on the bill, again requiring a constitutional majority of either 26 or 51 members, and then it gets enrolled. It kind of makes it official looking and very neat and tidy, and then sent to the governor for review. Enrolled bills then. So we're kind of at the stage where the governor is about to decide what to do. So enrollment is the process of getting the bill all spiffied up basically to send to the governor for his or her consideration. So if both chambers pass a bill in the same form, it's prepared with all the approved amendments and at that point is enrolled. And when that happens, the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House sign the version to make it nice and legal. And the Secretary of the Senate or the Chief Clerk on the House side certify that the bill started out in that chamber as an SF for Senate or HF for the House. And the bill is then sent to the governor for final action. So the governor's action, you think, would be kind of simple, but not so much. This will take a couple of slides to explain. So basically, the governor takes final action on all bills passed by the General Assembly, and there are three options. The governor can sign the bill, can issue a direct veto of the bill, as something, not a full veto, but particularly for appropriations bills, the Iowa governor has the statutory power, well, constitutional power, to item veto appropriation bills. So bits of spending could be cut out of what otherwise was agreed upon by both chambers. So appropriations bills have that particular extra component, so there's a secondary type veto, if you will. And the governor can take no action. So if there is a veto, then the legislature could override the veto. It takes a 2/3 majority, the constitutional majority version. So assuming there are 50 people voting and 100 people voting in the respective chambers. So 2/3 of those numbers need to vote to override. Otherwise, the governor's veto stands. If the governor doesn't sign a bill or doesn't veto a bill during the session, it'll become law after 3 calendar days of inaction. So bills can get adopted without a gubernatorial signature. Governors like to have signing ceremonies, so especially, of course, if it's a legislative item that they really want to talk about and make a big deal out of their success. So bills received by the governor during the last 3 calendar days of the session had to be signed or vetoed within 30 calendar days after received. So, as it turns out, there are actually 3 kinds of vetoes. I talked about 2, but there's a third one. So there's a straight old veto that says, I don't agree to this. And the governor will probably have a press conference that says why. An item veto, we kind of talked about before, line item vetoing out, particularly in legislation for expenditures of funds, such as appropriations bills. There's also the pocket veto. So the pocket veto is what happens when the governor doesn't act within that 30 calendar day window on a bill that gets received within those last 3 calendar days. At that point, the whole bill just collapses. So when the governor vetoes or item vetoes a bill or part of a bill, she or he is going to send a veto message explaining that action, and the chamber of origin with the bill gets that veto message first, gets filed with the Secretary of State, and then the legislature could override the veto if 2/3 of both chambers, 2/3 of 50 and 2/3 of 100 vote to override jointly. Alrighty, and now we're kind of ready for this to become a law, right? So this has gone through the meat grinder several times over in some cases. A little bit like the game of telephone, what started out as maybe a sort of relatively nice and simple bit of legislation is going to get carved up and formatted, and it could look quite a bit different than what it was at the outset. So after the bill is signed by the governor or is passed by the legislature over a governor's veto, which is relatively rare, it gets sent to the Secretary of State, who becomes the custodian of the original copies of all the bills. July 1st is a common starting time for these bills if they're not vetoed successfully by the governor. But some of the bills indicate a different date than July 1, but usually the beginning of the fiscal year is when the magic happens and these new bits of legislation take effect. If something gets signed by the governor after July 1st, then August 15th is a typical date at which that sort of late blooming law gets in force. And then the enacted bills are printed, now that means electronically, in the Acts of the General Assembly, and they're published after each session. So these, of course, pile up over time. And within a relatively short amount of time, especially now with things being electronic, the portions of the enacted bills that are laws of a permanent nature get built into the Iowa Code. Have you seen volumes of the Iowa Code? Lots. So, and this, by the way, you can look this up actually sort of like in a Wayback Machine, way back at the founding of the state. I think you can go back to 1839 actually to see what was done way back then. So the Iowa Code is a compilation of all the Iowa laws published every year in this electronic format. And they actually are in print as well from LSA. So, a lot of moving parts, fairly complex series of activities that are involved for anything to become a law. And you could ask yourself, well, how do I know what's going on with any one of these at any given time? I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. And I know you can't see this well from where you're sitting, but you can track bills, ones that are alive right this very minute, well, out of session, right? But once the legislature is back in operation, you can track the legislation, and you can kind of go backwards as well. So this is really what you're going to see, and I know you can't see it very well. So I'm going to take you to the actual URL, and I'll make that a little tiny bit bigger. Can you see that a little bit better now? Okay. So you could, now the tricky part of this is you have to either have a clear topic to search on, or you have to know exactly what SF number it was or what HF number it was. Once you know that, the rest is easy. You may have a little bit of work to do, though, to figure that out. So, but this is where you would go. This is part of the homepage for the Iowa legislature, and it is literally called the bill version tracking. So why version? So remember, the bill can start out saying one thing, then it gets carved up, pieces get lost because they're not supported anymore, and other pieces get added on. So things leave, things come into the bill, and those are the different versions. So the bill can have many multiple versions over its legislative history. So if you don't have anything else to do at 3 in the morning, this would be a good activity. It might cure the insomnia after a little while. But it can be absolutely riveting to kind of see the ball bouncing back and forth, sort of like a ping pong match between the two chambers. So that's bill tracking. So I thought I'd take a very non-controversial example just to show how this works. And again, this is about abortion. You've ever heard of that as an issue? Right, okay, so something that's sort of below the radar screen, but still kind of worth talking about, I think. So as you know, there was recent action by the legislature and the governor, the so-called heartbeat bill. Okay, and that tells you something else about the legislative process. There's something of a gotcha element in this. I guess that's a fair way to say it. So there can be a special session called by the governor to try to get a really top priority item through if it wasn't moving well enough through the normal legislative process. And that's kind of the storyline here. So I'm going to give you like the short version of this, and I'll tell you about the history of abortion in Iowa. The really quick version. But it kind of tells you about the fact that you can have a legislative session that lasts, I think it's just a couple of weeks maybe, in which the heartbeat bill was eventually passed. But there is, better part of a century of history before that happened. And I need to try to explain the fact that things can happen really fast after they take a very long time to come to a head. So again, let me take you to the URL so you can see a little bit better. So this is more or less working backwards, one could argue. It's a little bit too big, I guess. Here we go. So the end product looks like this. This is July 14th, 2023. It's a letter signed by Governor Kim Reynolds, sent to the Secretary of State, that's currently Paul Pate. You notice his address is the state capital too. And then the statement from the governor says, Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby transmit House File 732, HF 732 would be the short way to say that. An act prohibiting and requiring certain actions relating to abortion involving the detection of a fetal heartbeat and including effective date provisions. So that's your heartbeat bill signed into law, basically. And then down below that, there's the actual text of the legislation. If you enjoy reading through legalistic stuff, this is for you. But the main point here is that this is like the end product of the legislative process. So, where did that come from? Well, I'm glad you asked that question too, because remember about the bill tracking? So if you were to punch in HF 732 in that bill tracking website I showed you earlier, you'd find this kind of information. So this is the bill history for HF 732. Status is signed by the governor, so this is after the sort of final action has been taken. And it tells you who the floor managers were. It tells you about related bills, not just this one, but previous efforts on the heartbeat side. And then it talks about this bill having been passed through the Committee on Health and Human Services, entitled A Bill for an Act Prohibiting and Requiring Certain Actions Relating to Abortion Involving the Detection of a Fetal Heartbeat and Including Effective Date Provisions, parenthesis, formerly HSB, which is short for House Study Bill 255, and that gives you the effective date, July 14th, 2023. So this is after the final act. So you can kind of go backward, sort of way back machine-like in a way, although this is kind of for the short run. So July 11th, 2023, during this special session. Sessions typically end about the beginning of May. So this is a couple of months after everybody assumed things were over, I guess, but not so much. So this heartbeat bill was introduced, sort of off session, if you will, but it still counts as a legislative action, even if it's not during the regular session. So then it went on a calendar as HJ, House Joint Resolution 1054, and then it'll tell you about amendments. You can see where I'm hovering. You can go to the inner guts of these things. You look at each amendment separately. So a whole bunch of those, amendment, 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 amendment. And it passes the House by constitutional majority, 56 to 34. As HJ 1059. Then there's immediate message from the House, read for the first time in the Senate, and substituted for a Senate file, 579, and we're not quite done, but you notice this is all on one day, right? Okay, this is exceedingly rare, but that's the whole point of the special sessions. If you got a really super duper priority and you're governor, and you darn well want to get this bill done, you sort of have to get the ducks lined up in the proverbial row in advance. Make sure you've got the constitutional majority, and then you can just slide things through pretty quickly, as opposed to the usual legislative grind, which would go on often for months on a single bit of legislation. And so eventually it got to, through the Senate, by a constitutional majority of 32 yeas and 17 nays, in the guise of SJ 1112. The vote was explained, there was immediate messaging sent out from the Senate. The reported bill was correctly enrolled, signed by the Speaker and the President, that's President of the Senate, and sent to the Governor as HJ 1063. It was signed by the Governor, enrolled as a bill, and then, if you want to see a summary of the legislation, there it is. So, yes,
SJ and HJ refer to journal pages.
journal pages.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you.
Senate Journal.
Okay, good, thank you. So then you get sort of a backgrounder on Senate study bills that were kind of the predecessors to this action. And a lot of detail here, basically. So you see, July 11th, most everything happened. 3 days after that, it becomes law. Now that's lightning quick. That's not the way things usually work. But for, as I was saying, for top priorities, that's what happens. Okay, so that happened in like 4 days, July 11th through 14th, right? All right. Abortion has kind of been an issue for a while, right? So I thought it might be interesting to tell the backstory here. So in the end, it took like 4 days to do the heartbeat bill thing, right? Okay. That's kind of the latest major iteration on abortion legislation in the state. You can do a way back time machine kind of thing here. This happens to be from the American Civil Liberties Union, which has a sort of obvious interest in the topic. And this timeline basically takes you back to prior to Roe versus Wade, 1973. It doesn't give much detail on that, but it talks about prior to Roe versus Wade, that abortion in Iowa was illegal up until that point. And then you have Roe versus Wade kicking in January of 1973. It gives you a quickie overview of the 1973 to 1990s time period. Abortion in Iowa is legal with relatively broad access to abortion services and few changes. 2013, this was chipped away in part through the telemedicine abortion ban. So telemedicine is used pretty commonly, of course, to receive medical services and medication, prescriptions for the medication at least, electronically, but anything involving abortion was banned as of 2013. So that was probably the first major sign that something major was coming. 2017, Iowa imposed a 72-hour waiting period law. This, of course, all was going through the legislature and the governor's office. 2018, you had a 6-week abortion ban passed. They refer to that as abortion ban 1.0, by the way. And so this is the so-called fetal heartbeat bill, the first part of it at any rate. 2020, there was an abortion constitutional amendment stating that, well, basically trying to outlaw abortion through an amendment to the Constitution. 24-hour waiting period law was passed. In 2022, the Iowa Supreme Court permitted the 24-hour waiting period to go into effect following lots of litigation led by ACLU and some other groups. Then we had the overturn of Roe versus Wade by the U.S. Supreme Court, the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision, June 24th, 2022, so that's still fairly fresh. And in 2023, the 6-week abortion ban 1.0 law actually was not revived, but a different version of that after some amending, 6-week abortion ban 2.0, a new version of the 6-week abortion ban that was adopted through a special session. Notice a special session kicking in. And then in 2024, the Iowa Supreme Court upheld what ACLU is explaining as a near total abortion ban. The heartbeat bill is more or less designed to do that. And then the Iowa Supreme Court issued a ruling, as you may recall, as this kind of recent history, by a 4-3 margin. You may recall that the Iowa Supreme Court was split 3-3. One of the justices recused herself, and so I'm not sure anybody knew exactly how she was going to vote, but it turned out she was on the side of limiting abortion rights in the end. So that 4-3 ruling basically brought a stop to major efforts, at least of the courts, to try to overturn the heartbeat ban. And then the ban goes into effect officially on Monday, July 29th, by the way, which wasn't that long ago after all. So that gives you some sense about things evolving over a fairly long period of time, several decades, for, well, better part of a couple of centuries, really, because you're going back to the 19th century for much of this. So these issues get to the forefront, and if there's enough political muscle behind one side or the other of the legislative concept, it probably will become law if the push is persistent enough, has constitutional majorities behind it, and of course having a governor of the same party as the persuasion of the majorities in the House and Senate helps enormously. So we have a trifecta. Get a majority through the House, majority through the Senate, governor signs. That's really about it, unless there's court action that might intervene. Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about subcommittee hearings and committee hearings, notice to the public, opportunity to be informed and heard on the topic? There's been some grumbling over the last few years.
Yeah.
Are these things covered by the rules, or who makes those rules?
Well, we've got an expert on that here. I don't know, Herman, could I? Yeah, I don't know exactly who physically does it. It's the leadership, basically.
What specific is the question, or do you want just sort of general?
General.
Okay.
I mean, there's been a lot of bills passed in the last few years, and there's been grumbling about this stuff happening in the dark of the night on 8 hours notice. I don't know if that's an exaggeration or not, but can you talk a little bit about that process?
Well, okay, I never served in the House. so I can't comment on how they do things. When I was first elected to the Senate, began serving in 2003, a subcommittee meeting often consisted of the chair of the subcommittee walking around the chamber and getting the signatures or not getting the signatures of the other subcommittee members. Okay, we generally didn't have public subcommittee meetings. Then something happened in the 2004 election. It came up to a 25-25 tie in the Senate. And unlike some other states where the lieutenant governor presides and can break ties, that's not true in Iowa. There is no tie-breaking mechanism. So we had co-floor leaders and co-chairs and co-presidents and co-everything all the way up and down. Well, I was the co-chair of the local government committee, and I had served on city council here, so I had sort of a local government view. And my opposite number co-chair from the other party was Doug Scholl from Indianola, and he had a similar local government background. So the two of us said, well, look, we really ought to have a mechanism for taking public input. So we made a rule in our committee, we could do that. We made a rule that every subcommittee, before it reported out a bill, had to have a public subcommittee meeting, and they had to have 24 hours advance notice. So that significantly increased our workload, but I like to think it also significantly increased the quality of our work. Now, in 2017, subsequently the Democrats took the majority for about 6 years, actually 10 years. In 2017, the Republicans had the majority, and many, not quite all, many of the committees abandoned the 24-hour notice rule as a formal rule. We continue to try to shame the other side into announcing 24 hours in advance that they're going to have a subcommittee meeting, and they do still have to have a public meeting. About the only good thing that came out of the pandemic was that in the Senate and in the House, the subcommittee meetings went virtual. So you didn't have to be at the Capitol, you didn't have to hire a lobbyist to be at the Capitol. You could sit at home on your computer and plug into the subcommittee meetings. In the Senate, we actually allow people to comment from online. In the Senate and the House, I don't think they do that. But so that's kind of a little bit long-winded, but that's really the history of it. You can participate in subcommittee meetings. In the Senate, you don't have to be there. You can comment from online. Like I say, I think it has significantly improved the quality of work at the expense of a lot more work to be done.
Okay, so it's evolving.
So I would hope that the House would at some point take comments from the public online. That would be the one innovation that I would say is a good idea. There are other ways in which things are done in the dark of night. Sometimes amendments, either in the full committee or on the floor of the full House, amendments are introduced with no particular notice. There are a number of times that that's happened when bills have been turned inside out and upside down. I wish we had a rule in the Senate that said if you're going to file an amendment, you have to file it at least 24 hours in advance. I'd like to see that, but that's not the case today.
So it could be at 3 a.m. you find out about something.
Yeah, I can think of one on the AEA bill this year in the House. I believe this is the case. Obviously, I wasn't in the House, but there are 3 different major classes of functions that AEAs perform. 2 of them are media and special services. And an amendment, I believe, was introduced in the House literally in the dead of the night that would allow local school districts to take the money for the media services and the specials and use them for anything they wanted to. And the Democrats on the House, somebody piped up and said, that means they don't have to use them for media services, and the Republicans said, no, they voted it through. Well, the Democrats were right about that, and that fact may lead to substantial undermining of the funding for the AEAs if the school districts choose to use that money for other services, and they've got a lot of things that are underfunded right now in other areas.
Well, that's kind of where we are.
So,
Yes,
Matt,
Yes.
knowing people start talking about SF 416, or ACAP, is there an easy cross-reference to find the bills and go back and forth between the House and the Senate when you're talking about if they're both working on it?
well, yeah, so,
If I could point out, you've got the
Please.
screen right up there.
yeah,
You were talking about bill tracking before. You got the full page display, that's nice. But on the left-hand column there where it says bill history, that's basically the same sort of thing, bill tracking. You can track, what happened in the Senate, and then it came over to the House, and what amendments were filed and accepted or defeated, and stuff like that. It's a cramped column, and you have to expand it and blah, blah, blah. Not very readable, but you can find out what's going on with the bill.
and you can click on the guts of these. It's
Yeah.
legislative ideas, right?
And if you want to know who voted how, you click on the Senate Journal or House Journal link.
Let's try that one for the Senate Journal. So that's an eye chart. Let's see. Yeah, so this is assignment to a subcommittee, right?
Okay.
So it depends how many rabbit holes you want to get into, I suppose, basically.
But you can find, let's say you wanted to find a topic on CAFOs, if there was legislation. Can you just go back into the bill tracking and find it on CAFOs?
Well, let's see here.
See, as wonderful as it is, I find it hard, very hard.
So you want to search by topic, not by bill?
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
remember numbers and.
Go back one slide. Go back one slide. Yeah, now on the left-hand side, all right,
That's just static.
you have there, where you can enter the bill number is the first, I don't know,
Is that where we should be?
no, not that, not,
Not there.
close that one.
Okay.
It's not a web page, it's a slide.
That's the point, yeah.
If you maximize that window, it might change the way it looks so that it looks more like the slide.
Well,
Find legislation.
yeah, let's go there.
That's
Okay, that's
So
all of
there's no
this.
legislation pending now.
Yeah, okay. So that's an empty set of information.
There is a subject matter index, I think it might be under that link, but during the session,
Mhm.
it's not, how should I put this? It's not comprehensive.
But there you have a keyword, that would help. right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if you
Yeah,
have,
you will see that on the legislature's homepage, you'll see that on the left-hand side. Yeah, if you click on keyword and then put in whatever the keyword would be,
well, let's try CAFO and see what happens. Is it going to let me do that? Oops. FO.
Probably won't be by the,
Maybe not that
There.
yet. No, let's see. Nope.
Yeah.
And it may not be working because it's out of session.
there are no bills that are pending
Yeah.
right now.
yeah.
Because, in an election year, once the legislature adjourns, all the bills that were in the process are all dead. In a non-election year, a bill that was in the process in the first year of the two-year session is potentially and usually still a live round in the next year.
Okay.
Is there a different keyword that might work, or is it just because it's out
I
of session?
think it's trying to search an empty database.
Yeah. Okay.
I think they're not working.
And have you, Carolyn, did you try keywords when you did it?
Once, yeah, I do.
Type
And
in,
then-
try typing in abortion, see if that brings up.
Okay.
If
so-
that doesn't work, then it won't work at all.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
Yeah,
not
so
there.
it's just-
Is it LSA, by the way, that decides what you can see and what you can't, or is that leadership?
No, that, yeah, LSA maintains the website.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right, that's all right.
Okay.
Well, one quick thing, even as you tracked the abortion bill timeline,
Yeah.
does, since this is General Assembly, does it put in there what the action is of the court? Like when they were having to not, you know, when the Iowa Supreme Court would not let the bill go into effect at first, whatever that word is, put an injunction. So, I mean, like this General Assembly passed it, but it didn't go into effect because the state Supreme Court initially had an injunction. Like you said, when the justice who abstained, but then the next time it came up, it passed 5-4 because she didn't abstain. But so even if a bill is through all this gauntlet and signed and all that, it may not go into the effect if a Supreme Court has ruled it
Yes.
invalid or put an injunction on it.
Right.
And
And-
that doesn't show up in here though.
No. Yeah, the ACLU website would give you better tracking on that.
There you go, okay.
And then, of course, if the legislature gets enough sufficiently hot and bothered about a Supreme Court decision, there could be new legislation introduced that tries to circumvent those injunctions, of course.
Later, and that takes,
Yes. So the fun never ceases, basically. It's just constant back and forth, yeah. Okay.
We may have time maybe for one more question.
Okay.
One more question for Dr.
So
Shelley.
who wants to run for the legislature now?
Well, we want to thank you very much for this
Linda, thank you.
informative presentation.